September 14, 1943, Camp Crossroads, New Mexico. Sergeant Daniel Morrison stood in the sweltering afternoon heat outside the newly constructed prisoner of war compound, watching as 3 transport trucks rolled through the main gates carrying cargo that would fundamentally challenge every assumption he held about warfare, humanity, and the thin line separating ally from enemy. These were not the battle-hardened German soldiers he had trained to guard, nor the defiant Japanese prisoners whose reputation preceded them across the Pacific. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Instead, stepping down from those canvas-covered vehicles were 73 Italian women, their faces marked by exhaustion and confusion, their military uniforms dust-covered and torn, their eyes scanning the American desert landscape with a mixture of fear and something Morrison could not quite identify. These women had been auxiliary corps members, medical personnel, and communications specialists captured during the Allied invasion of Sicily. They represented something the American military command had not anticipated, and did not know how to process. Morrison had received his orders 3 days earlier with minimal explanation: prepare facilities for female prisoners of war, ensure appropriate supervision, await further instructions. Nobody had told him what appropriate meant when the prisoners were women who had been serving their country just as he served his. Nobody had explained how to maintain military protocol while addressing the basic reality that these were not enemy combatants in any traditional sense, but rather individuals caught in the machinery of a war they had not chosen. Morrison had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a dairy farmer who believed in hard work, simple food, and treating people with basic decency regardless of circumstances. His mother had packed him sandwiches for school every day of his childhood, the same combination of peanut butter and grape jelly on white bread that had sustained generations of American children through the Depression. It was cheap, it was filling, and it required no refrigeration. When Morrison enlisted in 1941, he had never imagined that this humble sandwich would become the centerpiece of a moment that would test his understanding of what it meant to be both a soldier and a human being. The women who emerged from those trucks on that September afternoon carried with them stories that Morrison would not learn for weeks. They had served in the Auxiliary, the Italian auxiliary forces established to support military operations while Italian men fought on multiple fronts. Some had been nurses tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Others had operated radio equipment, coordinated supply logistics, or worked in administrative capacities that kept military operations functioning. They had not carried weapons into combat, but they had worn uniforms and served under military command, which made them prisoners of war under international conventions that had been written with male soldiers in mind. The compound at Camp Crossroads had been constructed in haste. Barracks designed originally for male prisoners had been modified with whatever materials could be requisitioned on short notice. Privacy partitions made from salvaged lumber divided sleeping areas. Additional latrines had been installed, though the plumbing remained temperamental. The perimeter fence was standard, 12 feet of chain link topped with barbed wire, with guard towers at each corner. Morrison had spent 2 days ensuring that his guards understood the assignment. These prisoners were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. They were to be provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care. They were not to be mistreated, threatened, or subjected to any conduct unbecoming of American soldiers. Most of his men were young, barely out of training themselves, and Morrison could see the uncertainty in their faces as they processed orders to guard women who looked like their sisters, their cousins, their neighbors from back home. The first meal presented immediate complications. The camp kitchen, operated by a rotating crew of Army cooks whose culinary skills ranged from adequate to barely tolerable, had been instructed to prepare for the new arrivals. The menu that evening consisted of what the military classified as standard fare: boiled potatoes, canned green beans, beef stew made from ingredients that had been sitting in storage for months, white bread, and for tomorrow's lunch rations, the kitchen staff had prepared 300 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper, ready for distribution. Morrison had approved the menu without much thought. It was food. It met nutritional requirements. It was what American soldiers ate, and prisoners of war were entitled to receive rations comparable to those provided to the military forces holding them. He had not considered that food carried cultural meaning beyond mere sustenance, that what seemed normal and unremarkable to an American might be completely foreign to someone from another country. Maria Rossini had been a communications operator stationed in Palermo when Allied forces landed in Sicily. She was 24 years old, educated, fluent in 3 languages, and she had joined the Auxiliary because it offered opportunities unavailable to most Italian women in 1942. Her family owned a small vineyard in Tuscany, and she had grown up understanding food as something more than fuel. Meals were social occasions built around fresh ingredients prepared with care. Bread was made daily from flour, water, salt, and thyme. Cheese came from local producers whose families had been making the same products for generations. Vegetables were harvested from gardens and prepared within hours. Even during wartime rationing, Italian cooks found ways to transform limited ingredients into meals that honored tradition and maintained dignity. When Maria looked at the meal served that first evening at Camp Crossroads, she saw food that seemed designed to minimize effort rather than provide nourishment. The potatoes had been boiled until they lost structure, becoming a gray mass that bore little resemblance to the vegetable. The beans had been heated directly from cans, retaining the metallic taste of their containers. The beef stew contained meat of questionable origin floating in thin gravy that tasted primarily of salt and pepper. The bread was soft to the point of being structureless, nothing like the crusty loaves she had known her entire life. The women ate because they were hungry. They had been traveling for days, transferred from military custody in Sicily to a staging area in North Africa, then loaded onto a transport ship that had crossed the Atlantic and finally moved by train and truck across the American Southwest. They had eaten little during the journey, and their bodies demanded calories regardless of quality. But Morrison, watching from his position near the mess hall entrance, could see the expressions on their faces: confusion, disappointment, something that looked like resignation. They ate mechanically, without pleasure, treating the meal as an unpleasant necessity rather than a moment of respite from their circumstances. He made a mental note to speak with the kitchen staff about improving food quality, though he knew that military kitchens operated under constraints that limited what could be accomplished. Fresh ingredients were scarce. Refrigeration was limited. Everything was designed for efficiency and shelf stability rather than taste or cultural appropriateness. The following morning brought what Morrison's commanding officer called a familiarization briefing. The women were assembled in the compound's central yard, and through a translator, they were informed of camp rules, daily schedules, and expectations for conduct. They would be assigned work details appropriate to their skills and consistent with international law governing treatment of prisoners. Medical personnel would continue practicing their profession in the camp infirmary. Those with clerical skills would assist with administrative tasks. Everyone would participate in maintaining the compound, preparing meals, and managing daily operations. They would receive regular mail privileges, access to Red Cross packages, and opportunities for recreation within the confines of the camp. Morrison delivered his portion of the briefing in what he hoped was a tone that conveyed firmness without hostility. These women were prisoners, but they were also individuals who deserved to be treated with basic respect. At noon, lunch rations were distributed. Each woman received a wax paper package containing 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a small bag of potato chips. Morrison watched as the packages were opened and the sandwiches revealed. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Maria Rossini unwrapped her sandwich and stared at it with an expression Morrison initially read as confusion. The bread was white, soft, and square, clearly mass-produced. Between the slices was a layer of brown paste and a layer of purple jelly, both spread with mechanical precision. She lifted the sandwich cautiously, examining it from different angles as if trying to determine what it actually was. Other women around her displayed similar reactions. Some sniffed the sandwiches suspiciously. A few pulled them apart to investigate the contents more closely. One woman, whose name Morrison would later learn was Francesca Di Lorenzo, took a tentative bite, chewed slowly, and then made a face that suggested she had just tasted something fundamentally wrong. Morrison had expected many possible reactions to American food. He had anticipated that prisoners might find military rations bland or unfamiliar. He had prepared for complaints about quality or requests for different options. What he had not anticipated was the look of complete bewilderment that spread across the faces of women trying to understand what they were eating. Maria, after examining her sandwich thoroughly, took a small bite. The texture was her first surprise. American peanut butter in 1943 was thick, sticky, and adhered to the roof of the mouth in a way that Italian food never did. The jelly was intensely sweet, much sweeter than any preserve she had encountered in Italy, where fruit preserves retained the tartness of the original fruit. The combination of these 2 elements sandwiched between bread that tasted slightly sweet and had the texture of foam created something that her palate could not categorize. She chewed slowly, trying to identify what she was tasting. The brown paste had a nutty flavor certainly, but it was unlike any nut preparation she knew. Italian cooking used ground almonds in desserts, whole hazelnuts in confections, and pine nuts in sauces, but never anything like this thick, homogeneous spread that seemed designed to stick to every surface in her mouth. The purple jelly was recognizable as fruit-based, probably grape, but it was so sweet that it overwhelmed any subtle flavors the fruit might have contributed. Together, the elements created a taste profile that seemed designed for different priorities than any food she had previously encountered. American peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, Morrison would later learn, represented an intersection of industrial food production, economic efficiency, and American cultural preferences that had no equivalent in Italian experience. Peanut butter had been developed as a protein source that required no refrigeration and could be produced at scale using industrial processes. Jelly represented preserved fruit that could be manufactured year-round without regard to growing seasons. White bread was the product of commercial bakeries using refined flour that produced consistent results at low cost.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The women's confusion stemmed not from the food being bad in any objective sense, but from it being fundamentally different from anything in their cultural framework for what food should be. Italian cuisine prioritized fresh ingredients, regional specialties, and preparation methods that often required significant time and skill. Even simple Italian foods like bread with olive oil or tomatoes with mozzarella reflected values of quality, freshness, and respect for ingredients. The American sandwiches represented opposite priorities: shelf stability over freshness, standardization over regional variation, speed and convenience over preparation ritual. These were not better or worse values, just different ones shaped by different economic circumstances, industrial capacities, and cultural histories. But to women who had grown up in a food culture where even wartime meals maintained connection to traditional practices, the sandwiches represented something alien and vaguely disturbing. Morrison noticed the reactions but initially misinterpreted them. He assumed the women were simply unfamiliar with peanut butter and jelly, and that exposure would lead to acceptance. Americans ate these sandwiches by the millions, children took them to school, workers carried them in lunch pails, soldiers consumed them in the field. They were nutritious, inexpensive, and practical. He could not understand why anyone would find them objectionable. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Meals from the camp kitchen were eaten with varying degrees of acceptance depending on what was served. Dishes that resembled Italian food, even if prepared poorly, were consumed without complaint. Rice could be eaten even if it was overcooked. Pasta, when available, was welcomed even when the sauce was merely tomato paste thinned with water. Vegetables were acceptable regardless of preparation method. But the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which appeared in lunch rations 3 times per week, were increasingly rejected. Women who had eaten everything else on their plates left the sandwiches untouched. Some tried to trade them with guards for different food, offering to exchange their portions for extra bread or fruit. Others unwrapped the sandwiches, attempted a single bite, and then rewrapped them to discard later. Morrison found stacks of uneaten sandwiches in the compound's waste bins, each one representing food that had been prepared, distributed, and rejected. The situation came to a head during Morrison's weekly inspection of the compound on September 28. He was walking through the barracks when he noticed a gathering of women in one corner, speaking rapidly in Italian with animated gestures. Maria Rossini was among them, and when she noticed Morrison's presence, she approached him with a determination that suggested she had been elected spokesperson for a collective grievance. Through the translator who accompanied Morrison on all interactions requiring communication beyond basic gestures, Maria explained the problem. The sandwiches, she said carefully, were causing physical discomfort. The peanut butter was too thick and sticky. It made swallowing difficult, especially in the dry desert climate where water was rationed. The intense sweetness of the jelly was causing nausea, particularly among women who were already struggling with the stress of captivity and uncertainty about their futures. Several women had developed digestive issues that the camp medical officer attributed to the combination of unfamiliar foods and the stress of their situation. But beyond the physical complaints, Maria explained something that Morrison found more difficult to process. The sandwiches made the women feel disrespected, not intentionally, she emphasized. She understood that American soldiers ate the same food. But the sandwiches represented an assumption that food was merely fuel, that one meal was equivalent to any other meal as long as it contained sufficient calories. In Italian culture, food was more than nutrition, it was connection to home, to family, to identity. Being given food that seemed designed without any consideration for taste or cultural appropriateness felt like being told that their backgrounds and identities were irrelevant. Morrison listened to this explanation with growing discomfort. He had not intended any disrespect. He had simply provided standard rations, the same food that fed American soldiers across the country. But Maria's words forced him to recognize that treating everyone the same was not the same as treating everyone appropriately. The women were not American soldiers, they came from a different food culture with different expectations and different needs. What seemed normal to him was foreign to them, and forcing them to adapt to American norms without any accommodation of their backgrounds was in its own way a form of cultural erasure. He promised Maria that he would speak with the camp commander about the situation. In the meantime, he authorized the women to decline the sandwiches without penalty and arranged for alternative lunch rations to be provided. This was not standard procedure. Prisoners of war were entitled to receive rations comparable to those given to the military forces holding them, but there was no requirement to provide choices or accommodate cultural preferences. Morrison was stepping outside official guidelines, but he rationalized his decision by noting that wasting food served no military purpose. If the women would not eat the sandwiches, there was no point in continuing to provide them. That evening, Morrison sat in his quarters writing a letter to his mother that he knew would never accurately convey what he was experiencing. How could he explain that he was struggling with questions about food, of all things, when Americans were dying in combat across Europe and the Pacific? How could he make her understand that something as simple as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich had become a source of tension that revealed deeper conflicts about respect, culture, and the assumptions people made about what was normal? He found himself thinking about his childhood, about those daily sandwiches his mother had packed with such care. They had been made with love certainly, but also with limited resources during the Depression. Peanut butter was cheap protein, jelly made bread more palatable. The sandwiches had sustained him through school, but they had also been necessities born of economic constraint rather than culinary preference. His mother, given unlimited resources, would have prepared something different. Perhaps the same was true for American military food. It was not what anyone would choose if unlimited options were available, it was what could be produced efficiently at scale with available ingredients. Recognizing this did not solve Morrison's immediate problem, but it gave him perspective. The camp commander, Colonel Raymond Walsh, was a career officer who had spent 30 years in the Army and had very little patience for what he called complications arising from unnecessary sensitivity. When Morrison requested a meeting to discuss the food situation, Walsh's initial response was dismissive. The prisoners were receiving adequate nutrition, they had no grounds for complaint. If they were hungry enough, they would eat what was provided. Morrison persisted, explaining that the issue was not simply preference but cultural appropriateness and basic respect for prisoners who were entitled to humane treatment under international law. Walsh listened with visible impatience, then delivered a response that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. The colonel leaned back in his chair and said that war required difficult decisions and sacrifices from everyone involved. American soldiers ate what they were given without complaint. German prisoners in American camps received the same rations and adapted without incident. There was no military or legal requirement to accommodate cultural food preferences. If the Italian women were uncomfortable with American food, that discomfort was unfortunate but irrelevant to the mission of maintaining secure custody of prisoners of war. Morrison left that meeting feeling something he had rarely experienced in his military service: doubt about whether following orders was the same as doing what was right. Walsh was technically correct, there was no requirement to provide culturally appropriate food beyond meeting basic nutritional standards. But Morrison could not shake the feeling that hiding behind technical correctness was a way of avoiding harder questions about human dignity and cultural respect. The situation remained unresolved for another week. The kitchen continued preparing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. The women continued receiving them as part of standard lunch rations, and Morrison continued finding stacks of uneaten sandwiches in waste bins representing food that had been rejected and resources that had been wasted. Then something unexpected happened that would change everything. The Red Cross inspector arrived on October 8, 1943, conducting routine compliance checks on prisoner of war camps across the southwestern United States. Inspector Catherine Brennan was a formidable woman in her 50s who had spent the previous 2 years visiting POW camps and documenting conditions for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She had seen German camps, Italian camps, and Japanese camps. She had documented violations, praised compliance, and written detailed reports that were filed with international authorities monitoring treatment of prisoners of war. Brennan spent 3 days at Camp Crossroads interviewing prisoners, inspecting facilities, and reviewing records. She spoke with Maria Rossini and a dozen other women, conducting private interviews where prisoners could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. When she met with Morrison and Colonel Walsh on her final day, her report included several commendations for cleanliness, medical care, and overall camp administration. Then she addressed the food situation. According to her interviews, Brennan explained the Italian women were experiencing significant distress related to culturally inappropriate food. While the rations met minimum nutritional standards, the complete absence of any accommodation for Italian food preferences was creating unnecessary suffering that bordered on cultural insensitivity. The Geneva Conventions required that prisoners receive food of sufficient quantity and quality to maintain good health, and while technical compliance with this requirement had been achieved, the spirit of humane treatment suggested that reasonable accommodations should be made when possible. Brennan was careful to note that she was not criticizing the camp administration, which had been operating under standard guidelines. She was, however, recommending that consideration be given to incorporating some familiar elements into the prisoners' diet. This could be accomplished through several means: allowing prisoners to prepare some of their own meals using provided ingredients, incorporating Italian foods into the menu rotation when possible, or at minimum eliminating foods that prisoners found particularly objectionable when alternative options existed. Colonel Walsh received this feedback with barely concealed frustration, but Brennan's reports carried weight with higher authorities who wanted to avoid international criticism of American treatment of prisoners. Within 2 weeks, new orders arrived from the War Department clarifying that while POW camps were not required to provide ethnic-specific foods, commanders were authorized to make reasonable accommodations when doing so did not interfere with security or exceed available resources. The peanut butter and jelly sandwiches disappeared from the Italian women's lunch rations, replaced by simpler alternatives: bread and cheese, apples and hard-boiled eggs, cold pasta salads made with whatever vegetables were available. The camp kitchen also began providing basic ingredients that the women could use to prepare some of their own meals using a designated cooking area in the compound. The change was not dramatic. Resources remained limited, and the food available through military supply chains did not include many Italian specialties. But the women could now make simple pasta dishes using dried pasta, canned tomatoes, and basic seasonings. They could prepare bread in the traditional Italian style when flour was available. They could create meals that, while not elaborate, maintained connection to familiar food traditions and provided some control over an aspect of their daily lives that had been entirely regulated by others. Morrison watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Part of him was satisfied that a problem had been resolved in a way that improved conditions for the prisoners under his supervision. But another part recognized how unnecessary the conflict had been. If he had understood from the beginning that food carried cultural meaning beyond nutrition, if someone had explained during his training that treating people with dignity meant acknowledging their backgrounds and identities, the entire situation could have been avoided. The peanut butter and jelly sandwiches had never been necessary. They had been convenient, certainly, but convenience at the expense of human dignity was not efficiency, it was thoughtlessness. Maria Rossini would later tell Morrison through careful translation during one of their weekly administrative meetings that the food issue had represented something larger than just meals. Being a prisoner of war meant losing control over nearly every aspect of daily life: where you slept when you woke, what work you performed, who you could communicate with, and whether you would ever see your family again. All of these were determined by others. In such circumstances, food became one of the few remaining connections to identity and agency. Being forced to eat food that seemed designed without any consideration for cultural appropriateness felt like one more layer of identity being stripped away. When the camp administration made accommodations, even small ones, it acknowledged that the prisoners were not just bodies to be fed and housed, but individuals with backgrounds and preferences that deserved recognition. Morrison found himself thinking about those conversations long after they occurred. He had entered military service believing that following rules and treating everyone by the same standard represented fairness and justice. His experience at Camp Crossroads taught him that fairness required more nuanced understanding. Treating everyone identically was not the same as treating everyone appropriately. True respect meant acknowledging differences and accommodating them when possible. The women of Camp Crossroads remained prisoners until Italy's surrender and subsequent alliance with Allied forces created complex questions about their status. Some were eventually released and repatriated to Italy. Others chose to remain in the United States, finding work and building new lives in a country that had initially imprisoned them. Maria Rossini stayed in New Mexico, married an American serviceman she met after her release, and eventually opened a small Italian restaurant in Albuquerque that became known for authentic cuisine prepared using traditional methods. Years later, Morrison would visit that restaurant during a trip through the Southwest. He recognized Maria immediately despite the passage of time, and she recognized him. They spoke for over an hour, sharing memories of Camp Crossroads and reflecting on how a conflict over sandwiches had revealed deeper truths about respect, culture, and human dignity. Maria told him that she had never eaten another peanut butter and jelly sandwich after leaving the camp. The taste still reminded her of those difficult months of uncertainty and fear. But she understood now that Morrison and most of the Americans she had encountered had been doing their best within systems that had not prepared them for the complexities of holding prisoners from different cultures. The failure had not been individual cruelty but institutional thoughtlessness. Morrison left that conversation carrying something he had not fully articulated before: the recognition that small decisions about seemingly insignificant matters could have profound effects on human dignity and well-being. Food mattered not just as nutrition but as connection to identity, culture, and humanity. How people were fed reflected how they were valued. And institutions that failed to recognize this created suffering that could have been avoided with relatively minor accommodations and basic respect for human differences. The story of the Italian women prisoners and their encounter with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches might seem trivial against the backdrop of World War II's massive scale and devastating consequences. Millions died in combat. Entire cities were destroyed. Populations were displaced and traumatized. Against such catastrophic suffering, questions about food preferences seem almost absurdly minor. But Morrison came to understand that the massive tragedies of war were built from accumulated small failures of imagination and empathy. The inability to recognize that other people had different needs and perspectives. The assumption that one's own cultural norms were universal standard. The casual dismissal of concerns that seemed minor to those in power but were significant to those experiencing them. The proximity fuse had saved lives by making weapons more effective. The peanut butter and jelly controversy had illuminated something equally important, though far less dramatic: that respecting human dignity required attention to details that military efficiency often overlooked. That cultural sensitivity was not weakness but recognition of basic humanity. That small accommodations could make enormous differences in how people experience captivity, suffering, and uncertainty. Morrison retired from military service in 1946 with the rank of major, having served the remainder of the war at Camp Crossroads and subsequent assignments managing prisoner facilities. He never forgot the lessons learned from watching 73 Italian women try to understand why Americans thought peanut butter and jelly sandwiches represented acceptable food. He never forgot Maria Rossini's patient explanation that food was more than fuel, that cultural identity could not be ignored without cost, and that true respect required seeing people as they actually were rather than as convenient categories. In his later years, Morrison would occasionally prepare peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for his grandchildren, watching them eat with enthusiasm the food that had once been a source of such conflict. He understood now that the sandwiches themselves had never been the problem. They were perfectly acceptable food within their cultural context. The problem had been the assumption that everyone should accept American cultural norms without accommodation or recognition of difference. The story illustrates something that transcends its specific historical moment: that conflicts between cultures often arise not from malice but from failure of imagination, that institutions designed for efficiency often neglect human dimensions that seem minor until their absence creates unnecessary suffering, that respecting human dignity requires active effort to understand perspectives different from one's own. The Italian women who spent months eating American military food in a prisoner of war camp in New Mexico were not asking for luxury or special treatment. They were asking for basic recognition that their backgrounds mattered, that their cultural identities deserved acknowledgement, and that food carried meanings beyond nutritional content. When that recognition was finally provided, even in limited form, it transformed their experience of captivity from cultural erasure to something more bearable. Morrison understood by the end of his service that the real victory was not in forcing prisoners to adapt to American norms but in creating systems flexible enough to accommodate human diversity without compromising security or mission requirements. The women of Camp Crossroads taught him that strength was not rigidity but the capacity to recognize when rules should be reconsidered, when efficiency should yield to empathy, and when small accommodations could preserve human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The peanut butter and jelly sandwiches remained in American military rations throughout the war and beyond, feeding generations of soldiers and schoolchildren. They were efficient, nutritious, and culturally appropriate for those raised within American food traditions. But Morrison never again assumed that what was normal for Americans was therefore normal for everyone, or that feeding people adequately was the same as feeding them with respect for their humanity and cultural identity. The transformation at Camp Crossroads extended beyond meals into unexpected territories that Morrison had never considered part of his responsibilities as a camp administrator. The cooking area established for the Italian women became something more than a functional space for food preparation. It evolved into a gathering place where stories were shared, traditions were maintained, and connections to distant homes were preserved through the rituals of preparing familiar dishes. Morrison observed this transformation during his evening rounds through the compound, watching women who had been despondent and withdrawn begin to demonstrate skills and knowledge that their captivity had temporarily obscured. Francesca De Lorenzo, who had worked as a field hospital nurse before her capture, revealed unexpected talent for creating pasta from basic flour and water. She taught other women the techniques her grandmother had passed down through generations, kneading dough until it achieved the proper texture, rolling it thin with improvised rolling pins fashioned from cleaned bottles, cutting it into shapes that approximated traditional forms even without proper tools. The act of making pasta became meditative practice that provided respite from the psychological strain of indefinite captivity. Morrison watched these sessions and recognized something he had missed during the initial conflict over sandwiches. Food preparation was not merely a utilitarian task but a form of cultural expression that carried meaning far beyond the nutritional value of the resulting meals. The Red Cross packages that arrived monthly brought ingredients that expanded what the women could prepare. Olive oil appeared in small tins, transforming simple dishes into something closer to home cooking. Canned tomatoes from California could be converted into sauces that bore some resemblance to traditional preparations. Dried herbs allowed seasoning that moved beyond salt and pepper. Each package was treated as treasure, with contents distributed carefully among the prisoners and incorporated into communal meals that served social functions as important as nutritional ones. Morrison arranged for the packages to be delivered during evening hours so that the women could organize their cooking activities without interfering with daytime work assignments. The camp medical officer reported significant improvements in overall prisoner health and morale following the dietary accommodations. Digestive complaints decreased substantially. Weight stabilized among prisoners who had been losing mass due to stress and unfamiliar food. Sleep patterns improved as anxiety levels declined. The doctor noted in his official reports that while he could not establish direct causation, the correlation between dietary accommodation and health improvement was sufficiently strong to warrant continuation of the modified feeding arrangements. Colonel Walsh, reviewing these medical reports, grudgingly acknowledged that Morrison's persistence regarding the food situation had produced measurable benefits that justified the administrative complications. The lessons Morrison absorbed during those months at Camp Crossroads would influence his approach to leadership throughout his military career and beyond. He learned that regulations and protocols existed to serve human needs rather than replace human judgment. He discovered that flexibility within appropriate boundaries often produced better outcomes than rigid adherence to standardized procedures. Most importantly, he recognized that respecting cultural differences was not weakness or unnecessary complication but essential acknowledgement of human dignity that improved outcomes for everyone involved in difficult situations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.